Hey everybody, welcome to Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With. Today we are going to be doing something that we haven't done yet, which is we're going to do a debate review. Now this debate that we're going to review is between William Lane Craig and Greg Boyd. So William Lane Craig is probably someone that you've heard of. So William Lane Craig is a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University, and Greg Boyd is a pastor at a church in Minnesota, I believe, and he did his PhD from Princeton. So they're going at it about the topic of penal substitutionary atonement. This is something that I feel quite passionate about. So when I saw that they were debating this, as much as I disagree with both of them, I was excited to see how they would kind of approach this topic, knowing that
Boyd had some good complications.
He did, yeah.
He had some good complications, yeah.
As we'll see as we kind of go through this, there are points at which I think Boyd concedes too much to Craig and is possibly stepping over into the same problems with atonement that Craig ends up committing, as far in terms of where I'm coming from. But he does have some great points. He's written in, I think he wrote in one of those like 4 views on atonement books. Greg did, and then
he was also in the book Case for Christ, which is,
I didn't believe Laura when she told me that.
Yeah, he wrote he was the Jesus seminar guy in Case for Christ, and a bunch of people got real cranky when we talked about his chapter because they said that we were using the word pastor as a slur, and we were absolutely not. There's nothing wrong with being a pastor and writing these kinds of books. It's just that you can't really be a great representative of the Jesus seminar if you are in fact a critic of the Jesus seminar and a pastor.
You look like a ghost for a second.
I know, I look like oh yeah, there you go. I look like Jodie Foster from the poster of Silence of the Lambs.
Okay, so with that, we're kind of gonna watch through this. We've got this timestamp, so we're gonna stop it occasionally. So I should mention that this debate took place on, I forgot to even say what this was. It was on Unbelievable, which is with Justin Brierley. It's a big show that brings in a lot of Christians and non-Christians to be in dialogue and debate each other. And then also we're going to be on 1.25 speed for this. So it's going to be a little bit faster. I can't quite do 1.5 speed because my brain is slow and I'm kind of dumb. I know that Ian and Laura can do that, but my brain does not work that fast.
If you really want to get what they're saying, you should probably watch this or listen to the podcast before, because we're just going to glance through this so we can talk back to it. You're going to have a hard time picking up what they're saying if you just listen to
this. And I'm going to link it in the description of this video too. So
before we get into the technicalities and just have you sort of lay out the groundwork here, Bill. What do we mean by this view? This is the central view that you defend. It's not the only view you explain in the book, this penal substitution.
Right. And that's critical to my position. It seems to me that any adequate theory of the atonement needs to be a multifaceted theory that will include a variety of these New Testament motifs, like justification, penal substitution, ransom theory, moral influence, and so forth. And so any theory of the atonement that attempts to reduce the atonement to just one facet or motif is going to be incomplete and inadequate. And so I believe that penal substitution is one of the essential facets of a full-orbed and biblically adequate theory of the atonement.
Yeah, so it's important to pick up on what he's saying. So he says here, to open things, that penal substitution is one among many facets of the atonement. So we need all these different images and metaphors and ideas. And only then, when we include all of those together, do we have a sort of, can we get to a correct account of the atonement? But he's actually going to shift things a little bit here. He's not going to actually commit to penal substitution being one among many. He's going to do something different with it. He's actually going to center it in a way that I would have liked to hear a bit more about why he chose to do it.
I would like to hear why he did, because I skimmed through his book, and I feel like this is something that comes up with a lot with penal substitution, guys, is they mention that, like, well, all these other views are here, but the penal substitution is, like, the most important, the most central.
Because it makes sense of everything else.
Yeah, that either it makes sense of everything else, which I think you have to show from there how other Christus Victor doesn't really seem to have anything to do with punishment, I think. So how you build on that to that is, I think, a really difficult question. And then also why, so even if you don't have that, then it's it seems like you have to come up with some other reason why this is most central. Like, does it come up in the most text? No. Do most New Testament authors witness to it? No. You see, it seems like they've got a lot of problems there. If you insist on it being some kind of centerpiece idea.
Yes,
but
right.
Yeah.
And in that, of course, you do though say in the book that you believe that penal substitution is, in a sense, the core motif.
Right, there you go.
Yes, gemologists call the central facet of a jewel the table. And I do think that the table of your atonement theory, that central facet that anchors the others, is penal substitution, because it makes sense of so many of the other facets.
Right, so he's just sort of asserting that at that point. But kind of want to give him the benefit of the doubt in that I haven't read the book.
Right.
So.
I'm having a really hard time thinking of how penal substitution how can you build on that to Christus Victor?
Yeah.
Like, how can you build on, because like ransoms and punishments are just different things.
They're categorically different.
Right. So,
right. Let's keep going.
Obviously, you've written a whole book that deals with this in great depth, but in a nutshell, is there a way that you would sum up what penal substitutionary atonement means, what that doctrine is?
Yes, I think that penal substitution is the doctrine that Jesus Christ bore.
Is it a doctrine?
It's like a suggestion. I would say.
Well, it's a doctrine within a very specific.
The atonement
it's
is
a very
doctrine. This
penal
is
substitution
theory.
Penal substitution is very is known as a doctrine within specifically evangelicalism. That's it.
Yeah, specifically.
It's not in any other form of Christianity.
Yeah.
So
the suffering for sin, which would have been our punishment had we borne it.
Hang on.
Thereby he freed.
How does this even make sense as a metaphor? So Jesus suffers in our place. So there is a punishment that is God was going to give us for sin, and I assume in Craig's understanding, people who don't believe in Jesus will get it anyways. That punishment is that they will go to hell forever. Jesus was crucified in our place, and I guess it best went to the grave for 3 days. Sometimes people go with hell, but sometimes that's a bit too Catholic for folks, so they don't want to rock with that. How is a crucifixion a substitute for eternal damnation?
Right, that's a key question.
Yeah, that doesn't seem to make any sense to me.
He's going to kind of try to nuance that, the idea of somebody punishing somebody else. He's going to acknowledge that there are other sorts of ways of articulating penal substitution that don't have to go there. He goes there, he admits that, but anyway, I don't want to speak for him.
Freed us from liability to punishment.
And in that sense, that is an essential part of what it is to be forgiven, to when we accept that sacrifice made by Christ on the cross.
Why do you need to accept something done in your place? Why do you need to accept that?
Well, it's because you need a place for because this is such because this is an external account of the atonement where it's a transaction between
God and
Father
Jesus,
and Jesus sort of
and
and
then you have to hand out that merit in some kind of a limited. Yeah,
you need some way of appropriating that to actually gain. You need something to appropriate that to gain the benefits of it. So you need a place for faith. So faith would be the way that you actually access the benefits of the atonement. So
we're working out a lot of that stuff here.
People would be surprised to know that there's a whole philosophical literature on forgiveness and the nature of forgiveness. And one of the insights of this literature is that there is a distinction between forgiveness and legal pardon. These are not the same thing. And I think that divine forgiveness of sins is much more akin to a legal pardon than it is to the kind of personal forgiveness that we extend to one another.
So I think what he's doing is anachronizing. So he said in the philosophical literature, we have this distinction between legal pardon and forgiveness, sort of personal forgiveness. And he's saying, I think God is more like that, these categories. What he's doing is actually retrojecting a certain kind of philosophical
our
discussion.
Modern distinctions,
back on, and he's going to do this again. And this is actually one of the gripes that I have with how he's articulated or how he goes about articulating this as the debate goes along, is that when he doesn't know an answer to a sort of biblical, quote unquote, biblical or theological question, he'll go, oh, I can draw from these philosophical categories and sort of retroject those onto the text and sort of pick from those and say this is what God's like.
So I'm gonna go out on I'm gonna guess that what he means by the difference between forgiveness and pardon is that forgiveness is reconciliation between individuals, and pardon is the remission of a punishment or the state of being considered a criminal. And because we have these pre-existing categories of what God is like, we've decided that this is more what God is like. Why does Paul call himself the minister of reconciliation then? He calls his mission the ministry of reconciliation, like personal reconciliation, and like the dividing line between the Jews and Gentiles in Ephesians. Like I can think of a lot of places where the reconciliation image is actually very front and center. Yeah, so sure. I don't know why we're going to say, oh, that's not what he means. That's not what he means.
No, I think he would agree with you on that. The sort of like
it's just less important
stuff. No, I think he would agree with you on the person-to-person forgiveness stuff. He's just saying God's forgiveness isn't like that. It's more like a legal pardon.
But surely the ministry of reconciliation that Paul carries out, that's between God and us, right? Like we urge you be reconciled to God. That's what he says in 2 Corinthians. Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In personal relationships, personal forgiveness does not absolve guilt or make a person into a new creature.
So that's key. Apparently, legal pardon makes you into a new person.
Is Roger Stone a new man? Is Roger Stone a new man? I don't think he is.
So I think what's happening is he's inserting another discourse there, possibly without really realizing it, of sort of ontological transformation into this sort of legal scenario, these legal metaphors, and just assuming that they work fine, that this legal stuff does the transformative stuff and is part of that somehow, without actually asking, how is that even possible? How can a legal transaction actually be really, truly transformative and changing of the person who's being pardoned? It doesn't. It just pardons you. Right. A pardon is just a speech act.
Right.
So, tell me how that actually changes you other than just asserting it.
Legal pardon absolves the condemned criminal from guilt and constitutes him a new man. He is as innocent in the eyes of
the language of constituting someone as a new person. That's not how law court metaphors work at all.
Yeah.
It's not. So again, it's inserting another discourse without really realizing
the law as if he had never committed the crime. And that's what divine forgiveness does for us.
You're still the same kind of person. Again, like this gap between sanctification and forgiveness. It's as though you had never committed a crime consequentially. You're still the same person who did it.
You don't get transformed. Yeah.
You're still the same kind of person who did it. Yeah. I just feel like this doesn't really make any sense of ethical deliverance.
Yeah. So this may sound nitpicky to some people, but really think about this.
Right.
Like really, really think about this. Does being declared innocent, being pardoned, actually change the constitution of a person?
Yeah.
I think the obvious answer is no. Yeah. It doesn't.
Yeah, and also it might seem nitpicky to people, but also I think this is worth just asking: what is the gospel? Yeah. Is the gospel that we got away with a bunch of stuff, or is it? I would hope it's a lot more foundational than that. That there is genuine freedom and genuine change in our persons, and that like there is a possibility of personal transformation and societal transformation when people band together around this. I would hope we can all agree that's true. I just don't see how this builds out of his system. So,
Before we come back to Greg to sort of give us sort of his response to penal substitution, many people characterize it as, and the problem that many people have with it is the idea that God punishes an innocent party in place of us who did deserve the punishment, as it were. And they see that as somehow morally wrong. That how can that constitute justice in that sense? So well, is that the view that you take of what it represents, God punishing Jesus in our place?
Well, notice the way I framed or formulated the doctrine of penal substitution. Some penal substitution theorists, notably John Stott, has said we should never say that God punished his beloved son. Rather, penal substitution means that Jesus bore the suffering that would have been my punishment if it had been inflicted on me instead. It would have been my just desert. And by bearing that suffering, he thereby frees me from liability to punishment. So, in fact, it is not an essential element of a penal substitutionary.
So removing the Punisher from this scenario doesn't really make any sense. For there to be any kind of just desert taking place, there would need to be somebody setting that up and enacting that scenario of just desert in the first place for that scenario to actually make any sense. When you remove the Punisher and the one who's actually in charge of that scenario desert and meting out punishment, it falls apart. It doesn't make any sense.
This is appealing to the John Stott idea that penal substitution can exist even if there is no agent who punishes, right? Which, to my mind, is just not what punishment is. You know, at some point, you know, like whenever we're trying to like grasp at metaphors to talk about the atonement, if we're talking about something that's so wildly unlike the thing that we're using as our metaphor, I don't understand why it's still valuable. You know, punishment is never something that is done agency-less in the world. You know, like if your child acts up and then that child gets a cold, that they have not been punished. You know, like just a bad thing happened to them. You know, a punishment has to have an agent.
It seems like a bit of an equivocation, actually.
Yeah, just directionless. Well, and I think that the goal there is to get God off the hook, so you don't wall yourself into this corner where God just needs to vent his wrath at somebody. Yeah. So it might as well be Jesus. Yeah. And you're saying, no, there's just this generic wrath that basically has a mind of its own, and it goes after Jesus instead of us. Right. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Right. You know, so
atonement theory that God punished Christ for our sins. That's open to the penal substitutionary theorist. That's one possibility, but it's not required. You can say instead that Christ bore the suffering that would have been my punishment, thereby freeing me from the liability to punishment.
I can see that, yes.
Hey, Laura, can you think of a modern law court scenario where someone is punished without someone enacting a punishment?
No.
Okay.
No, you can't send someone do generic bad things. You cannot send somebody to bad karma.
So I think what this is revealing is you can't run a law court scenario without having somebody who's actually doing the punishment. Okay.
It has to be God if you're going to run
this. A difference there, potentially, between those two. Is that where you end up landing, Bill, would you say? I mean, you're obviously keen to give an overview of all
No, I myself take the stronger view.
So Boyd kind of goes on to say, essentially on Craig's broad kind of inclusive definition, Greg essentially says, I would be considered a penal substitution theorist because I think there's an organic punishment for sin that kind of comes out of that.
Whatever that is.
Yeah. Organic, as again, he contrasts it with forensic or judicial.
Right.
Which is, I don't really understand that. I've never really seen that as a sort of discussion about these things. But
I mean, I think what Craig is calling like agency-less penal substitution, most people would just call some sort of generalized substitution idea. And I think substitution is present in, I think, everyone's atonement to some capacity, because we all acknowledge that we were not hung on crosses. You know, like Jesus did something that we did not do. Right. There's something vicarious happening.
But those
there.
are slightly different.
Right.
Things,
But you can't just fold all that into penal substitution on the grounds that, well, even if you don't think God did it.
Greg Boyd still thinks it's a punishment. He says that. He still thinks it is a punishment. So he still has a kind of punitive dimension to it. So that's a bit confusing to me. But anyway.
Sin that we deserve. And that's how we're reconciled with God. The only part of it I've ever really had a problem with is the idea that that retributive justice is an essential attribute of God, that all sin must be punished, bore the death consequences of sin, the theorist. Because while I frame it differently, I believe that Jesus stood in our place and bore the death consequences of sin that we deserved.
That we deserve. That is an interesting concession to penal substitution.
Yeah.
That we deserved. I would really love to know how he would spell that out a bit more, because it's just so confusing to me. If you are rejecting this idea that God is punishing Jesus for what we deserve, if you reject that, and then you're running with this organic idea where there's a consequence of that we are a part of that results from that consequentially, How is that something we deserve?
Right. I think where he's getting that is the whole wages of sin is death.
I know, but
idea.
it's still not. There's no sense of deserving that or justice.
Consequences and desserts are not the same thing.
And that's how we're reconciled with God. The only part of it I've ever really had a problem with is the idea that that retributive justice is an essential attribute of God, that all sin must be punished. And this goes to the legal framework again. When I talk about us,
so he pointed out what his main problem with it, which is the sort of legal framework, which he'll go on to say is his main problem is with the sort of retribution stuff. But the thing that I have an issue with is that Greg doesn't really press into that very much. He'll just say, I disagree with that.
Yeah.
And not really say why he disagrees with that. And
so
I really wish he would have really pressed into it more, but oh boy.
For Jesus bearing the death consequences of sin. That is what I think is the punishment of God, the judgment of God. It's the wrath of God that Paul talks about in Romans 1. He says the wrath of God's been revealed from heaven. And then it says 3 times says that God delivered them over to the...
Yeah, so I'm a bit confused. Again, there are plenty of different counts of the forensic that aren't just the specific law court scenario, especially in the ancient world. And it's really confusing to me why Boyd keeps conceding to him on that sort of stuff. Like, oh yeah, there is this kind of law court stuff going on in the Bible, instead of questioning what sort of law court or forensic scenario, is actually going on when there are forensic images, because there are.
Right.
But it matters what sort of forensic story we're telling. So
their reprobate hearts and all that. And so I see God in his mercy as hanging with us, saying, don't go down this road because it naturally leads to death. This way of going, God is life. And so sin is rejecting God. So sin is death. You're going down a death road. And God in his mercy tries to hang on to us, saying, don't go down that road. But there comes a point where if he sees his mercy is just enabling us, then God says, I have to turn you over and suffer the consequences of this. And that...
Do loving parents just turn away from their children to what their children want if they go too far away from a parent's love and mercy? No. No, absolutely not.
I know he wanted to play by the pool without a life vest on, but no, and I think that I'm sure that the answer we would get back to it is, well, parents do this with adult children, that, you might do some tough love with your adult children. But is that analogous to the relationship that God has with us? We're talking about an omniscient being, who is ostensibly all good and all loving and created us to be his children. And we are beings with a unspeakably tiny fraction of that understanding and ability to understand consequences. So the relationship,
and we're also in the grip of something that's kind of holding us captive too.
Right, exactly. Who are also, living in the veil of tears and the shadow of death. Right. Exactly.
But he goes to Romans 1, 18-32 there for the handing them over point.
Yeah.
It's when people appeal to that text and then the stretch of text in Romans 1-3, it's very fascinating to me how they use that. Mm-hmm. And it's never good. So let's go on.
Yeah.
It's never good.
I think the essence of the judgment of God. So I frame it all more in organic terms rather than legal terms. But if the appeasing God's wrath is not part of it, then we can still discuss the different meanings of this, but we're not as far apart as I thought we were going to be.
Well, that's very interesting to hear, but maybe it would help to tease out some of these terms Greg is using here. Appeasing God's wrath. Firstly, what do you take to be the meaning of God's wrath? I did mention that well-known line from In Christ Alone. On the cross as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. What does that mean to you, Bill?
Yeah. Well, I do think that God is incensed with sin. If God were not angry with evil, he would be indifferent to the plight of all the victims.
Agreed. Totally agree. On this specific point.
Yeah.
I have no qualms.
We'll give it to him.
With William Lane Craig.
All right, we'll give it to him.
I want to be generous.
Of sin and injustice. And so I think that it's quite proper that a righteous God would be angry when evil is done and people are victimized. And he's not a callous, unfeeling, impassible God, I think. But at the
preach
root of God's wrath, I think, lies this notion of retributive justice. It's not.
No. It's so funny. Going like this is how I feel a lot of times with evangelical Christians is they'll say stuff like this where I'm like, yeah, I totally agree. And immediately they'll step into like God is God of retributive justice.
Yeah.
What? You don't have to go there. How does he know that God's a God of retributive justice?
Well, I think what he's going to say is the Old Testament, that the penal codes, the sacrifice laws in the Old Testament reveal a retributive God, which seems like a huge
pulled through into
problem
the
for
anti-
him.
yeah.
Yeah.
Not just that he's angry, rather it is that his holiness and justice cry out for the just desert of sin, which is, I think, death. Death is both a consequence of sin, as Greg explained, but in the Old Testament, it's also a punishment for sin. All the way back into the story of the Garden of Adam and Eve, you have this legal terminology that indicates that sin is a capital crime that deserves death.
Is that what you have in Genesis 3? Is that what you have? Is that what you have is language of capital crime? What you have is on the day that you eat of it, you will die, which is not the same thing as on the day you eat of it, you will be executed. Those are two very different ideas.
Yep.
So
Adam and Eve weren't executed.
No.
Sin is both, or rather death is both a consequence of sin in this organic sense, but it's also a punishment for sin in the legal sense. And we mustn't attenuate our theology by eliminating these multiple facets. They're all part of the big picture, and we neglect any one of them to our detriment.
Greg, quick response before we go to a break.
I'll try. See, it seems to me I would agree with that. I think it is consequence of sin.
Again, Greg is conceding so much.
Yeah.
So much. He's conceding to this very sort of unspecified definition of the forensic and not really drilling into that, which is what I would hope somebody would do on this stuff.
Right.
Because that's important. And not just sort of letting him get away with saying, that stuff about Genesis 3.
The punishment of sin, I agree that it's expressed sometimes in judicial categories, but I think it's more fundamentally expressed in organic categories. But the organic seems to me to be the more fundamental. For example, if you're speeding and you break the law, well, then you get a fine. Okay? It's imposed on you. That's a judicial punishment, the legal punishment. But if you're speeding, going down a hill that has got a sharp curve at the bottom, and you, because you're speeding, don't make that curve and end up getting in a crash and getting injured, maybe killed. Well, see, that's an organic punishment, an intrinsic punishment, because there's no connection between the fine and speeding. But there is a definite connection.
Is organic punishment just the word we're using now for consequences?
I think so.
Like divine laws of karma, basically. Is that what we're doing? Okay.
I guess so.
Cool. All right.
And getting in a crash. And it seems to me that the reason you have the law is to warn people about the organic reality. The law is not the more fundamental thing, I don't think. It's in service to this reality. Do this, and it ends up in death. And so I just don't weight the legal terminology the way Bill does.
I think it's just indisputable that Paul's theology is suffused with legal terminology and the imagery of the courtroom. This is also prominent in the Old Testament.
Okay, so on Paul, I'm wondering where he's going to go, or where he would go for this kind of punitive imagery, which he claims is all over the place in Paul. Where? Just tell me where.
Court image is not.
Just tell me where. You're going for this punitive imagery in Paul, which is what he said. I think saying that it's all over the place without justification is extremely offensive, I think, to Pauline scholars who actually have worked on the relationship between the forensic and filial categories and all these other sorts of images we have for God. It's really irritating when someone who's not really studied in depth the relevant material makes these sweeping claims about Paul. It's just irritating. Sorry for the
to be punished for our sins, and that through the intervention of Jesus Christ, he has satisfied the demands of divine justice, thereby freeing us from our condemnation and liability to punishment.
What is the righteousness of God in Paul, or the justice of God in Paul? It's interesting that when Paul discusses the Dikaiosune theou, which is the righteousness of God in Greek, a lot of the time, especially in Romans, he will talk about it as a saving act, and he'll be drawing on the Psalms and some other OT material for that, this sort of story of divine kingship, this rescuing activity. And then in Romans 3, 20 and following, he says that this is revealed in Jesus. This isn't some righteousness that God has sort of up here. It's a righteousness that's revealed through Jesus's faithfulness in that text in Romans 3. It's Jesus is the righteousness of God. There's no other justice of God beyond that, which I think studying Paul will get you there. Studying Paul carefully will get you there on that meaning of God's justice and righteousness, and that will complicate the way that Craig is seeing things. It doesn't seem like he's been involved in those sorts of discussions, important discussions that have been happening for a long time.
Right, and the other big missing conversation here is, we had that sort of toss-off line about how penal imagery is throughout the Old Testament. Cool.
We're going to talk about this more in the next in the next installment of this. We just realized as we're going through this that it's going to take a long time.
Yeah,
so
we might need to break this interview up.
But he'll reference it a bit more later on, especially Yom Kippur and other stuff. So at that point,
which
we can
starts
kind of
today, actually.
It does, yeah.
Today's Yom Kippur.
So we'll kind of get into that more later when he's more specific about it. But yeah, I know where you're going with that. So
before we get back into sort of this categories you've described here of the legal versus organic way in which sin is a punishment, I mean, you have spoken very strongly against penal substitutionary atonement. I was listening to a sermon of yours the other day, Greg, where you got very passionate about the way that you see that this myth of redemptive violence, you called it, this idea that you can make things right by killing someone, by creating that kind of blood sacrifice.
He's a big fan of Walter.
Really?
And as I say, you've had this phrase frequently in writings, that this idea that God had to vent his wrath on Jesus in order to forgive us is just a completely wrong way of viewing God and the atonement. So what are the forms of penal substitutionary atonement that you really have in mind? If as you say,
so I think this is where Greg is at his best.
In terms of what Bill's representing, you're just framing it slightly differently, and you could even call yourself a penal substitutionary atonement sort of theorist if it was framed right.
I was good under some of the descriptions that the variety that Bill lays out, and I was also surprised at how broad that was. But okay, so. Bill said it just before the break that Jesus died to, I don't know exactly how you phrase it, but to appease or to satisfy the Father's wrath. And he uses that throughout the book. And that's the part, it alters your picture of God. It generates a number of difficult questions. Bill does as good a job as I can be done in trying to answer these questions, like how is Jesus innocent and yet legally guilty, and how are we guilty yet legally innocent, and how does this legal fiction or this pronouncement allow God to forgive us? And all those are created because of that idea that retributive justice is an intrinsic attribute of God. It seems to me that is, and I like to
press into that, dude. He keeps bringing up the problem of retributive justice, but doesn't really go for it.
Ask Bill this because at several points you called it a caricature. The way you presented as a caricature struck me as the form of penal substitution that I was taught, and that most of the people that I see is taught, like the students I teach and stuff. And it's all about. Here's an analogy that I was given. All right, when I was first a Christian. God's wrath, we were sinners and God was about to condemn us, send us to eternal hell because his justice must be satisfied. But Jesus, and a preacher actually did this, I'm not kidding, had a hammer and was going to smash this glass. And like the wrath of God was going to come down and crush us. But Jesus says, no, I'll take the brunt instead. And so he pulls out from behind the pulpit a cookie sheet, and the cookie sheet catches the hammer and vibrates. And that's how we now can go free.
Trinity, which I think he's identifying.
Justice was satisfied by punishing Jesus. It doesn't need to be satisfied by punishing us for eternity. Though I will say I've never quite understood how his 30 or 36 hours on the cross or being dead is just
Thank you, Greg.
for eternal. If that, how does that satisfy God's justice? If justice demand that we would be damned eternally, the multitude. But that's a different issue. So Is that a caricature, a complete caricature, Bill, or does that, the idea that Jesus absorbs the wrath that was destined for us?
I would agree with you, Greg, that God the Father does not vent his wrath upon Jesus. Rather, what he expresses is the just punishment for our sins. And here's why these legal motifs are so important. It's not that God is just emotionally angry. It's rather
it's the same thing.
that we are guilty of capital offenses. Yeah. We are like criminals who have committed capital crimes and whose just.
He thinks the idea that we really deserve it gets him out of that. And it really doesn't. Because a judge who is so sick of facing capital crimes all day, who went and opened a machine gun at an innocent party, no one would care that he was trying to work out his rage at genuine capital crimes. Like, the desert of the people who do not get punished is irrelevant when you're talking about what somebody did to an undeserving person. Like, it's just not, it doesn't carry over. It doesn't do the work that Craig thinks it does.
Yeah. So I think we'll end on one thing that you hinted at, that Greg didn't really touch on. I don't know if he does elsewhere, but it's kind of been looming in the background, which is the Trinitarian issues with this idea that God the Father is enacting his retributive justice on Jesus in our place. You'll notice that there's been a figure that hasn't been mentioned this entire about half hour, and that's the Holy Spirit, which should throw up some red flags for us, that we're not thinking carefully about the sort of God that is involved in saving and atoning us, right? The other thing it does quite, what I think quite obviously, but not a lot of people have actually talked about this very much, is that when you set up this God who is fundamentally retributive, God the Father is fundamentally retributive toward humanity because we sin, we deserve it, as William Lane Craig keeps saying over and over again. We're guilty. And then you have this other figure, Jesus, who is apparently merciful enough to take on that, to take on that retributive justice and to bear it instead of us. So you have this very merciful act by Jesus. Retribution, by definition, because it needs an object of punishment, needs to satisfy a punishment, right, to keep the book's balance, cannot be merciful. It cannot by definition be merciful. But Jesus acts in that merciful way, right? Why does Jesus do that? Why wouldn't Jesus just work to the problem is that they seem like two different beings if they're acting in two fundamentally and irreducibly different ways, right? Why wouldn't Jesus, if he's the same being as God the Father, help God the Father destroy us? Or be cheering on God the Father in us getting what we deserve. On the flip side of that, why wouldn't God the Father just be merciful if God the Father is the same being as Jesus the Son, right? And the Spirit's off apparently waiting for people to become Christians and to help them with their sanctification, I guess. So you've introduced this, I think, horrible Trinitarian problem that I would argue leads to a kind of functional tritheism.
Can I just riff on something for a second here? I feel like there's this common phenomenon in evangelical Christianity where the view that is most devoutly expressed and most enthusiastically defended is simultaneously the easiest to explain and the hardest to defend.
Right.
I think these go alongside each other. Because you also see it with biblicism, with the idea that the Bible is a perfectly internally coherent guide to all issues in life, which is very easy to explain. If you want to know how to solve anything, then someone will guide you through how to look through the Bible and get all of your answers for it. But is almost impossible to defend. Well, I mean, is impossible to defend. It doesn't work at all if you're working with the raw text of the Bible and you're not just allowing text to roll off the table for this or that reason. And I think you see the same thing with penal substitution. that there is this repeated problem of the fact that, you can draw this on a napkin of why someone should become a Christian. That, well, God wants to punish you, but Jesus took your right.
You have to draw the,
you do the little cross.
You have to draw the make sure you draw make sure you draw the guns of wrath that are coming from.
So it was
Jesus.
For us. It was cliffs. We had cliffs that you're over here and God's over here, and you draw the cross that goes. But yeah, you can explain this on a note card, which I feel like is this fascination for evangelicals of the simplest possible thing. That you can explain this on a note card that, like, well, God wanted to punish you, but then Jesus took your punishment. Therefore, you should believe in Jesus. Don't worry about what God's up to. But it's so easy to explain, and it is impossible to defend, and it doesn't fit with anything in Christian history. It doesn't fit with anything in Christian theological reflections. It doesn't fit with the church fathers. It doesn't fit with the New Testament. It doesn't fit with any of that stuff. But I think it's appealing because it is so simple, and it's so linear, like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, or you want this, so you do this and this.
I also think it happens for other historical and political reasons too.
Yeah.
That we like this kind of. I'll get into that in the next part of this because he kind of goes there. Helpfully for me, but also terrifying for me too. The other thing I would say is that it's interesting when people try to present penal substitution in a way that distance themselves from this sort of crude reading of it, or this caricature of penal substitution. That's the sort
People do this with biblicism too,
right? And so there's this way of trying to sort of claim that you're giving a nuanced position, but when you really strip it down, which is essentially what Greg Boyd did, when you really strip it down, it's basically the same thing. There really isn't much of a difference from the quote unquote crude, like megachurch pastor kind of way of presenting this theory of atonement than what this apparently more nuanced approach that Craig is giving. It's really the same thing at the end of the day. It's got the same inherent problems with retribution, with the Trinity. It's got some more problems that we're going to talk about next time with the OT. It's got some political and ethical problems that I also bring up in terms of projection from our own kind of cultural location and political location as well. It's really all the same thing. Greg Boyd says at one point that he thinks that this, I think he said at the very beginning that he thinks that William Lane Craig's book is giving a kind of fresh perspective on this, and I will say I highly doubt it. I haven't read the book. I really highly doubt it because I've read pretty much everything on this, and it's the same old thing. It's the same old thing. So anyway, with that, this has been part one of
first edition
Laura and Jon rant about penal substitution in the form of this review of William Lane Craig's debate with Greg Boyd on Unbelievable. So thank you for watching this. We'll have the next part out at some point in the near future too. Thanks everyone.
Thanks y'all.